Good evening all and welcome. Hospitals can be horrifying for a variety of reasons, as you're about to find out in tonight's episode. Tonight's artist in the spotlight who created some spooky artwork during our previous livestream is Aster. A link to his Instagram can be found on screen. If anyone has any creepy art that they have made specifically for the channel, or they just want to send in, feel free. And it could be featured in a video, Instagram, and more. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I worked overnight security in one of the largest, best, and oldest hospitals in the US. My fellow security officers and I all have stories about one building in particular, but the one that I'll tell is the one that happened to me. It was built in the late 1800s. It was the original psychiatric building for the hospital. Now, being the late 1800s, not much was truly known about psychiatric disorders. On top of that, this hospital was known for its medical research. With both of these facts combined, you can infer that some terrible stuff was done of these misunderstood psych patients in the building. A few years before I started working security there, this building had been converted into offices after the newly built part of the hospital dedicated a section for an updated psych ward. My rounds for that night happened to include said building. At night, this building was empty due to recently being converted into offices, and the drones who worked there wanting to leave promptly at 5, if not earlier, in some of their haste. They left their office doors unlocked, which is a big no-no due to medical information being located within them. It was our duty to go to each floor and make sure every door was locked, and if it wasn't, to secure it ourselves. I did my initial sweep of the building to make sure it was clear, and there was nobody in there, and proceeded to do my door checks. The hallways were pretty narrow, so I could check both sides of the hallway doors at once. At the end of this hallway, there were 2 sets of doors you had to go through to reach the final office, which was a dead end. Everything was secure. Awesome, time for the next floor. I exited the 2 sets of doors from the dead end office and stood absolutely frozen from what I saw. Every door ajar, set perfectly, so their own weight wouldn't cause them to shut again, and one wheelchair at the end of said hallway facing towards the step. I had heard other security officers outright reject that set of rounds due to strange stuff happening there, but I laughed it off until that night happened. I never took those rounds again. The older children's ICU is currently under construction to be turned into medical labs, so we have to patrol the area. Once again, to make sure the area is secure, or to report if the contractor/foreman stayed to plan for the next day. While patrolling this area, several security officers have reported seeing a single white male child between the ages of 5 and 7, sporting short brown hair. Imagine a 90s bowl cut. I personally dismissed this, as this was before the psych ward incident, as a tall tale told with the intent to scare me because I was new at the time. I got to that building patrol one night, and a foreman who stayed late called security and asked for a security officer to come up because a kid had locked himself in a room and he didn't want him to get hurt with all the open wires, or something to that effect. I unlocked the door for him, looked in what can only be described as a 10 by 8 room for about 10 minutes, and there was no kid. Called it a false alarm and finished my patrol. I also had a special detail, aka babysitting a violent psych patient, along with another security officer. He woke up in the middle of the night, recognized the other officer and said hello. He sees me and immediately starts screaming at me not to hurt him. Now, I'm a rather large gentleman, standing at 6'2" and weighing 250 pounds, but I try not to make myself too intimidating around psych patients, as to not escalate the situation. Well, he keeps screaming for me not to hurt him, and he says if I promise not to, he would make something good happen to me. He promised. He calms down and goes back to sleep and I forget about it. Next day I got a permanent set of rounds and a pretty good promotion. Easily coincidence, but interesting nonetheless. This is my final encounter. A fellow security officer had rounds in the aforementioned psych building. Heard a call on the radio in what could only be described as dry throat of terror voice. For one officer, for backup. I was nearby, so responded to his call letting him know that I was on his way. When I got there, he had his head between his knees and was silently crying, with a shattered chandelier a few feet from him. Now, before I had experienced the abnormal happenings in this building, I would have written off his testimony as idiocy. But he claimed that something held him in that spot as the chandelier started swinging violently until it began to fall. When it started to fall, he was let go and allowed to move, and scrambled out of the way before it crushed him. I got him up, calmed him down, and took him back to the supervisor. She yelled to one of our other supervisors, "Oi, Darren, I almost lost another one in that building." The other supervisor laughed and said, "Why do you think we always send the new guys? You know I don't even like going there." That guy is my roommate, and he hates it when I bring up that experience. I was in the orthopedic surgery wing of the hospital after getting my torn Achilles tendon repaired. It was a fairly long procedure, and I was pretty groggy from the anesthesia after effects combined with the morphine for the pain. But I did notice that I had a roommate that had both of his hands and feet wrapped in bandages. I could hear him talking to his father, but didn't pay much attention because of how out of it I was at the time. I did remember hearing something about, "Why did you stop taking your medication?" I don't know how morphine affects anyone else, but it gives me a very restless sleep combined with vivid dreams, almost nightmares, something I've never had. So in the middle of the night, while turning over for the 1,000th time, I spied someone standing beside my bed in the dark. "Got any smokes?" My roommate apparently was standing there watching me sleep, waiting for me to wake up to ask for cigarettes. It could be considered very polite or very creepy, but when you are in a morphine-induced haze, it was definitely creepy. Later that day, I heard the details of why he was there. He had gone off his meds and decided to quit smoking hardcore. I mean liquid nitrogen cold turkey. First, he nailed his feet to the floor so he couldn't go out for smokes. Then, he took a butcher's knife from the kitchen and cut off the fingers of his left hand so that he couldn't hold the cigarette. That's where his plan kind of fell apart, because he had a lot of trouble cutting off the right fingers with no left fingers to hold the knife. He only got through 3 of them. I put this together between the conversations I overheard between family, nurses, and doctors. I was supposed to be in there for another day, but they told me I could go home early if I was okay with taking Tylenol 3 for the pain. I would have to stay if I needed the stronger morphine painkiller, so the staff could administer it. I said I would go home with aspirin if it meant getting out of that room. The head nurse at the nursing station was sympathetic and said the guy really needed to be put in a different kind of hospital. But he had orthopedic issues that had to be dealt with, and that's why he was there. It wasn't supernatural, just a mentally disturbed individual who had hurt himself. He probably couldn't even have hurt anyone else considering his injuries, but in my morphine fog, it was creepy as hell to have someone that disturbed 10 feet away while I was sleeping. For the last 10 years, I've been employed by the Department of Corrections as a correctional officer, sergeant, and then lieutenant. Over those years, I've encountered quite a few things, ranging from relatively mundane to downright unsettling. So here it goes. The facility I work at used to be an old medical hospital for the state some years ago, but was repurposed to be a work camp and then eventually a correctional facility. For context, this place used to not have a fence when it first started. According to some of the older officers I worked with, I never bothered to look into the place's background until some of the stranger things began to occur. Trust me, I know it sounds cliché, but the more I researched, the more I discovered that a fair amount of old hospitals were repurposed into prisons. My first encounter with strange happenings came some years ago, when I was still a fresh-faced officer. The facility has two different parts. One side has a higher-level security setup, while the main side houses our lower-level offenders. At the time, I worked at the higher-level side, with the two-level offenders. For the most part, they behaved pretty well, except for a few times here and there, but that isn't important. What is important is that their cells had thick metal doors that locked whenever they closed. These doors could be opened via a mechanism that would unlock the doors all at once or individually with a normal lock. I was walking the halls, checking in through windows, making sure doors were secured, pretty much anything to get me through the night. For those that work nights, I'm sure I don't have to explain that some nights can be dreadfully boring. While performing my rounds, I turned the corner to head back to my office when I heard the loudest slam from where I had just come from. I turned back around, and to my surprise, all of the doors had somehow unlocked themselves and were flung wide open. Needless to say, all of the offenders were freaked out once they realized what happened, as was I. After ushering them back inside their rooms and giving another check, I went back to my office, almost expecting it to happen again, and phoned my sergeant and asked them what the cause could have been, and he just laughed. Now a bit of background on this guy. He was a sergeant for apparently forever. According to some of the stories I've heard, one of the old grizzled types, just jaded enough to keep the job but not enough to become fully disillusioned, if that makes sense. He was a good guy overall, had an older technique of dealing with some of the offenders, but I guess it came with the territory. I trusted him well enough. However, when he said, "Oh, that's just Ben acting up," I was skeptical. Who's Ben? One of our old TB patients. What? Yeah, the wing used to be part of the tuberculosis clinic back when the place was a hospital. So the ghost of some TB patient opened all the doors at once? Yeah, Ben, he's harmless, just annoying sometimes. Right. So needless to say, I asked around about the elusive Ben, and sure enough, some of the older officers corroborated the story. Sometimes he'd tap underneath the floors from the basement, open and shut windows, the whole 9 yards. Obviously, my instinct was to try and research the patients, but I guess due to the age, they didn't keep good records. Either that, or just simple ineptitude. With me being unable to research it, I chalked it up to superstition and moved on. Small things happened here and there as the months went on. I would do a round, come back to my office, and my cup would be in a different spot to where I left it, or someone would knock on my office door. But when I went to open it, there wouldn't be anyone there. Now normally I'm a pretty skeptical person, and would chalk those occurrences up to the long shifts or other officers pulling a prank, even though my dorm had doors that lock, and I can definitely hear when those big damn things would close. But as more things happened, the less sure of myself I became. Eventually I got promoted to sergeant. With that came more pay and more responsibilities. One of those included doing regular basement checks. Now I dreaded this, not because of the creepy factor, I could handle that, but because those basements are just slightly taller than cellars in most places due to the piping and electrical. Being a tall person, I hated doing basement checks, but since they were part of my responsibilities, I didn't complain too much. My knees, however, did. Surely enough, while doing one of these checks in the facility's medical building, I got another unsettling encounter. The basement of the medical building must have been an old morgue, since one of the rooms had that big metal wall with the slots for Bodies, I'm guessing. In the darkness, I tend to glance through that room as quickly as possible, and unfortunately for me, I noticed that one of the doors to the slots was open. To be honest, I was more irritated than scared, because now I had to do more thorough searching of the basement, and I radioed the situation to my lieutenant and let them know that I was going to be doing a detailed search. After cautiously entering the room, I found the light switch and went to work. Naturally, I found nothing out of the ordinary. I closed the door to the slot, gave the place one last sweep and headed topside to ask the medical staff some questions. General stuff, did anyone go down there, etc. Naturally, no one had been down there in a bit, since most of the basements are used for storage, and as convenient as a morgue body wall is for storage, it wouldn't have been the best idea to use it. Still, I couldn't shake that creepy feeling of being watched, even before I found the slot open. The next big event came in the dead of night. One of the more boring shifts. Mind you, this was back on the higher level part of campus. Though by this point, we had lost most of our higher level offenders, so it was pretty quiet over there. After talking to the officer responsible for the dorm, I made my way outside and to the sally port, an entrance essentially, to pick up some items. I spoke to one of the officers there for a bit, then made my way back to the dorms to resume a bit of paperwork and time killing. On the dorms, there are 3 wings, so the building essentially looks like a T, only all legs are equally sized, and each wing has 2 floors. Ever since most of the offenders were released or moved on, 1 floor of the wing has been utilized only. I tell you all of this because when I glanced upstairs into one of the windows, I saw what appeared to be the silhouette of something vaguely human. It was unmoving, didn't shift or appear as I kept my eyes on it while I approached the door to the dorm. I radioed the officer and asked what his location was. "I'm in the day room, Sergeant." "Downstairs?" "Downstairs." Crap. Keep in mind the wing that I saw the silhouette in was also entirely inactive and being used for storing old bunks, mattresses and other items. Also, there are doors that lead to the 2nd floor of each wing, and only sergeants and above have access to the keys that unlocked them. This entire time, I still had eyes on the person, so I talked to the officer again. "Meet me at your hallway door, please." "On my way." Eventually, he made his way to the door and we talked. I looked towards him to ask him if he saw what I saw, and of course, as soon as I looked back, the thing is gone. I felt like I was in a cliché horror movie at that point. I was expecting heavy breathing in my radio next or something like that. So once again, being that I saw something suspect, I had to be the dumbass to go check it out. I made my way upstairs, unlocked the door and checked the place out. Thankfully, the lights are practically always on up there, so I didn't have to deal with darkness like in the basement. As soon as I entered upstairs, the hair on the back of my neck stood up like I was being watched. I got this horribly uncomfortable feeling of not being welcome, like I had just entered a bear's turf. The entire time I was checking the place out, I couldn't shake that feeling. Eventually, I found the room where I saw the silhouette, and wouldn't you know it, there wasn't an item in the room. No coat rack with a big jacket to make it look like a person, no lamp with a hat on it, nothing. And after checking the doors and windows, I promptly got the hell out of there and met up with the officer again to let him know what I saw. He was understanding but seemed a bit skeptical since he was a newer guy. Can't say I blame him, to be honest. There are several other smaller things that have happened as well. I guess I've been here long enough to experience a vast variety of these things. More silhouettes in windows of abandoned buildings, old storage buildings that light up all at once at night, and then flicker on and off throughout the night. With that one, I told my lieutenant that my arse wasn't going to go in there alone, not at 1 in the morning. Objects moving on their own, even in our security footage. Hell, I've even spoken to several offenders who told me they hear voices at night in their room, and others that refuse to sleep in certain rooms at night at all. If you work in a place where you have access to security cameras and a board, definitely check those things out. I've seen chairs scoot around on their own, the hair of offenders move on its own, balls rolling on their own, and a few other things. Of course, I can't show you the footage. Legally, I'm not allowed to take it out of the gate, and I'm not going to lose my job for something that might be easily explained. Besides, being a lieutenant now, I mostly get to experience stuff like that throughout the cameras, or the stories that the officers now tell me when I make my rounds. Now, as I've said before, I hate going into the basements of various buildings for security checks. 2 of our main buildings have basements that must have been used to house patients back when the place was a medical facility, because the place is set up much like the hallways on the 1st and 2nd floor. When you think of where I work, don't think of one big cell block. Think more of a college dorm-style housing, at least on the main campus. I've taken my fair share of peeks around the basement, especially in the rooms and little cubbies that the place has, and the creepiest things I've encountered are the following. There is an old wooden door on one part of the basement that has the phrase, "Run away," scrawled into the wood. Now obviously when I first saw it I was a little freaked out, but since the words were on my side of the door, I quickly figured that it must have been a previous officer or other staff member that did it. The maintenance staff run through the basement all the time. Hell, it could have even been one of the offenders, since before the pandemic, they used to work with the maintenance staff. Not really paranormal or anything, but a neat little thing I wanted to add. In several of the older rooms, I've seen actual chains and places in the stonework where manacles once resided. When I first heard about it from my sergeant at the time, I obviously brushed it off as some workplace nonsense that they tell you to freak you out. Gotta get through nights somehow, right? But sure enough, I saw it. The realization happened. Yeah, the place used to be a medical facility. God only knows what kind of crazy, inhumane stuff went down here. We also have a tunnel network, and I wish I was joking. It has a full-on tunnel network that connects most of the buildings. Now this is one of those where I don't want to do too much poking around with, mostly because I mean tunnels. Obviously I'm yet to explore them fully, but I found some of the dead ends. It's weird as hell to turn a corner, walk a little, and then have the tunnel stop all of a sudden. I'm guessing they had plans for expansion or something at one point, or maybe even old buildings that got destroyed over time. When I asked the veterans about the tunnels, I got this. So why does this place have an entire tunnel system? That's how they transported the bodies, so the other patients wouldn't see them. What, so all the buildings are connected? To the old morgue? Yeah. Foolishly, it was around this time I finally decided to do some deep digging of the place. Now, I previously said the place was a hospital, then a work camp, then a correctional facility. But unbeknownst to me, it started off as an asylum. Once I learned that, obviously that little spark of excitement and muted fear entered my head. Like I've mentioned previously, I'm a skeptic, always have been. But when you learn what the old buildings you walk through regularly were part of, and had a TB wing, well, the horror movie buff inside me was practically giddy. One of the strangest things I've had happen to me involves me doing what 90% of my time was spent doing at night, walking around old buildings and checking doors. I was assigned to the administration building that night, and after the place settled down, I decided to make my rounds of the place. Now the building has a few places: a library, visitation rooms, classrooms, you name it. The main attraction, however, was the administration hall proper. This is where the warden's office resides, among several other of our higher-ups. At night, this place is pretty dead since most of the admin folk work their 8 to 4 shift. I was checking every door to make sure they were locked, when I heard something further down the hall start to rattle. For a visual, the hall is designed like a blocky, chubby U-shape. The sound seemed like it was coming from the other leg of the U, whereas I was on the opposite leg. I turned the corner and made my way down after calling out to see if someone was there, to no response. That's when every door in the hallway started to shake all at once, as if a horde of zombies got their cue to burst out the hallway. I'm not ashamed to admit that I booked it the hell out of there and closed the door behind me. Having been an officer at the time, I let my sergeant know, and once again was met with, "Yeah, that happens." Having been one of my earlier encounters, I obviously said, "What the hell do you mean, that happens? How messed up is this place?" Their answer? Very. Leave it to me to find a career in a place where everyone is just numb to weird, unexplainable stuff. The last story I have is the creepiest one I have to offer. Doors shaking and stuff moving, I can kind of explain away. But this one, well, I can't explain it away easily. Now, I'm not a drinker. I don't smoke weed, never tripped on shrooms or anything like that. The worst I do is smoke and have a caffeine addiction, but whatever. I preface because I need you to know that I was sound of mind and body when I had the following little interaction. One night, as per usual, once the offenders had gone to bed and the place was settled, I was up doing rounds and browsing Reddit for a bit. Most nights at the time were spent browsing Reddit and doing security checks. Not a bad gig, right? Then, I saw some movement going upstairs. Confused, I thought it was my sergeant or another higher up that came to do their rounds. Figuring I'd break up their solitude, I went and searched for them, for some chatting for the night. I didn't hear boots going up the stairs, but I had a quiet sergeant at the time, and I just called out to them, "Hey, Sergeant Red." There was no response. I turned the stairs to head up, and at the top of the stairs is a door with a window in it. Well, I saw what looked like a white sheet or something that moved away from the door. Weird, laundry was closed, and even if it wasn't, there wasn't a setup for a washer or dryer there anyway. I trotted up the stairs and opened the door, and saw what looked like a woman in one of those old white nightgowns facing away from me. Also weird because offenders aren't issued with granny clothes, especially not nightgowns. Okay, this is some kind of weird prank. We had female officers and still do on shift, since the place I work at is all female anyway. So obviously it was one of them having a laugh after being spurred on by one of the sergeants. I rolled my eyes and called out, "Alright, funny, good stuff. I've seen horror movies too, I know the trope. How the hell did you even get a nightgown through the gates anyway? Get a release for it from the warden?" There was no response. She moved into the room. It was a bathroom. Another roll of my eyes, and I made my way towards the room, stopping at the door. I announced my presence, as male staff have to announce before we enter a bathroom for obvious reason, and walked in. I checked the place pretty thoroughly and found, well, no one. The stall doors were open, shower curtains were pulled back, any hiding places were snuffed out. I was clearly seeing stuff, right? Well, my sergeant thought so, since by the time I got back to my office the phone was ringing. My sergeant called me. "Are you okay?" "Well, sort of. I saw you looking all weird and stuff when you left the bathroom." "Yeah. Hey, did you see anyone enter the bathroom before I did?" "Nah, dude, it's like 2 a.m. "Great, so I'm just losing my mind. It's fine." And then I told him about what I saw. He didn't seem too surprised, but this was the same cat that was unsurprised about literally every other weird thing that happened to me. I promise I work with other people besides him. There isn't anything else to that story, no grand discovery of an infamous woman in white or anything so romantic. Just some unanswered questions, like namely, what the hell did I see? I work at a psych ward that used to be a hospital in California. All stories happened during third shift between midnight and 8:30 a.m. The first thing was on the adolescent unit. Staff used to see a teenage girl enter one of the rooms, specifically 302. So many times, the patients that were in that room, not knowing anything about it, would see this girl sitting on the window still crying. I had one of the patients refuse to even sleep in there after seeing the girl. The patient was not schizo, nor had any type of impaired visual hallucination. Now, at this psych ward, you also have a woman that numerous staff have seen on a psych unit that we call Adult F. It used to be a maternity unit when it was a hospital, and supposedly the girl went into labor, lost one of the twins during birth, and also died. You can hear her saying, "Where's my baby?" over and over. The next one is on the children's unit. So my uncle works on the children's unit. About 2 years ago, a tech, someone that also works the unit, comes into the nurse's station saying to my uncle, "I just saw a kid go into the day room, and I went to go check it out, and no one was there." So my uncle puts up the security cameras, and both my uncle and the tech are watching the cameras, only to see this person appear on the camera and just stand there. Immediately both of them jumped back, and the tech said, "He's going to break." It left them scared out of their minds for the remaining 2 hours. This next story is also on the children's unit. So the one tech I know is watching a suicide patient, which basically is a one-to-one, and you're just making sure they don't do anything. The tech is sitting and watching the patient, and this little girl comes up to him and asks if she can get a glass of water. He says, "I can't get it for you, sweetie. You have to wait till the nurse comes back on the unit." She says, "Okay," and goes back to her room. He watched the girl go into her room. So the nurse comes back, and the tech asks the nurse that the girl in 202 wants water. The nurse says, "There isn't anyone assigned to that room. No girls were on that unit during the day." So the last one. The nurse I know was working on an adult unit for third shift. She said she was taking a selfie in the nurse's station and looked around to make sure there was no one around in the halls, or no patients or anything, because HIPPA. Well, she takes the picture, and about a week later is showing her friend. Her friend asked her who the guy in the background was. She showed the picture, and it was a tall, black figure. I'll have to ask her if she still has it. The only time I saw anything paranormal was in the children's unit. I heard children running in the hall at night while everyone was asleep, and when I go to the day room at night, I get a very frightening feeling. I work on a busy surgical floor and do 2 12-hour days, then 2 nights, and then off for 4. During my day shift, I had a patient who was only in his early 50s but had terminal cancer and was in extreme pain, as it was all throughout his bones. He decided to undergo physician-assisted suicide and asked that I be in assistance. The doctor came and performed the procedure on my second day shift. The next night, I came in for my shift and had a new patient that was a 45-year-old man who had just had a small bowel resection staying in that room, and he got back from surgery that morning, was totally clear, walking around okay, and was only taking Tramadol for pain. He was completely oriented and not confused whatsoever. Anyway, around 3 a.m., he comes around and starts ringing his bell, and I go to his room, and he asks me why this other patient keeps coming into his room and telling him to leave. He seemed genuinely freaked out and a bit annoyed, so I asked him to describe the patient, and he did. I couldn't really think of any other patients on that floor that fit the profile. This entire time, our care aide was sitting outside his room, charting on her mobile workstation, and she just so happened to be parked near his room. I asked if she saw anyone and she said no, so I started looking in all the rooms but everyone was asleep. I told the guy I'm not sure who it was, but if he bothered him again to ring right away and let one of us know. 45 minutes later, Buddy rings again and it's the same thing. I look around and couldn't see anyone. The care aide was still there and she said no one had been out that she saw. I asked for the description of the guy again, and this time I wrote it down, as I was going to tell security, and as he's describing the guy, he mentions this fish tattoo on the forearm, and I think, weird. The guy in here before who died had a tattoo like this in his forearm. Then I told that to the care aide, and she was the one who then mentioned that it sounded like the guy who died, and I got freaked out, and we were both really creeped out after that. I just told the guy to go back to bed and that we were dealing with it in the hallway. I have never been so creeped out in all my life. I work LTC on a dementia unit. We had a resident who was our baby. She had been a don of a nursing home and would stay up until midnight with us talking about work, asking about MedPass, etc. She was always a nurse at heart. She got really bad and ended up in bed in about August. She wouldn't eat nor drink. I think maybe she took 360cc a day for the first week. Eventually nothing. It took her nearly 4 weeks of nothing to finally pass. I took a week's vacation on week 3. I said my final goodbyes, came back, still kicking. I couldn't believe it. She passed in September. So since she had passed, we have had 2 patients in her room. One was a lady who had a stroke, rehabbed to home. Pretty with it, and she would turn on her call light and whisper, "There's a lady in my bed." We would reassure her, show her the empty bed, and this went on her entire stay. She kept seeing a lady in her bed. One of her last nights, she rings crying, "There's a lady in my room. I know you don't believe me, but it's true. You don't want to believe me." Patient number 2 still resides in that room, an older gentleman with dementia. He rings every so often saying there's a lady in his bed, or a lady in his room. I bet it's got to be our cute old Don resident. I don't really believe in ghosts, but I had an experience a few months ago which gives me doubt. It was about 2 in the morning, and I was sitting alone at the desk charting. In my peripheral vision, I saw a lady standing at the desk and I jumped a little. I looked over and there was just a vase with flowers. A few minutes later, it happened again, and I figured that the flowers were just messing with my tired brain. So I moved them behind a desk. A few minutes later, though, I jump again, because I swear I saw a figure standing there out of the corner of my eye. I just thought I was tired and on edge. But then one of the aides walks down the hall and rounds the corner and gasps. She says, "I just saw a woman standing there, but she's now gone." So that was strange. There's an old story from that unit about how during a change of shift, a patient flatlined on the telemonitor and everyone ran into the room. The patient was unresponsive and barely had a palpable pulse. Turns out her glucose was less than 20. They straightened her out, and once everything was settled, they realized the patient was not in the telemonitor and had never even had the telly on. I've had a pretty traumatizing death happen in a room. My first code. Nothing we could have done. For a few weeks, I got a creepy feeling like I was being watched around that room. Cut to now 3 months later, and that room is empty, and I need to use the computer since the others are taken. We walk in, and then I literally yelped and jumped because I thought I saw someone sitting in the recliner in the room. Then, as I was charting, I kept feeling like someone was behind me watching me. So I leave, talk to my coworkers, and we stupidly decide to download ghost radar apps, which I know are not anything reliable, but 3 separate apps all picked up an entity in the room, when they didn't pick it up anywhere else. One picked out the word wish, and then another picked up a form outside the door that looked like it was looking at me. I don't normally believe in ghosts, I'm not religious, but after this night I felt so scared and like I needed to go to church. Others have had patients tell me they feel a dark presence in a room where someone has died. Call lights go off when there aren't patients. A lady in white is often seen on camera, but the nurses never see her even though they're right in front of them. Lots of scary stories. It's a surgery center, so people aren't expected to die. But it does leave a lot of bad juju when it does happen. I used to work in downtown Detroit. This was my first job. My old unit used to be a children's ward back in the early 1900s, and there are numerous reports of people seeing a little girl running around. At 2 a.m, one of my IV pumps starts beeping, so I go into the first room and find that for some odd reason, it had infiltrated. As I'm placing a new IV, I notice that my patient is staring hard into the corner of the room. He finally asks me, "What's that little girl doing on the ceiling?" I literally thought I was going to lose my mind. I walked out of the room, and as I'm telling my coworker about the creepy experience, the IV pump in the room right next door starts going off. Walk in to find her IV had gone bad too. This woman had severe dementia, and would just talk a whole bunch of gibberish, like no real words. It just sounded like mumbles. So right as I'm about to put her IV in, she goes, "See the little girl? See the little girl? Where's the babysitter?" Seriously, so done. I just wanted to walk off the unit and never come back. In 1978 or 79, I was working as a nurse aide. I was doing patient care as well as learning to be a medication assistant, or med aide. One day at work, I had one of my patients pass away. We have about half hour to 45 minutes to prepare the body for transportation and family. I had been working with him for almost half hour from the time he was pronounced dead. Side note, at least 3 people confirmed he had passed when I turned him from his side to his back, and he started breathing again. I stopped what I was doing and started to figure out if I was actually seeing what I thought I was seeing. He was breathing again. I reached out to check for a pulse and I found it. I can tell you at 18 that was the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. I called for my nurse because he was breathing again and she told me I was mistaken and that sometimes the body does things that make it seem that way, but that he wasn't actually alive. She walked over to him to show me and found his pulse. She told everyone that had been notified of his passing, the mortuary, his family, the facility, everyone. After we had both confirmed he was indeed alive again, she had to go call everyone back and tell them that he was alive. But he passed away for the second time 24 hours later, and he stayed dead that time. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. Any budding artists out there, anyone who's good with a pencil, I certainly am not, feel free to send me your artworks and, it could be on the channel soon or the Instagram or stuff like that. Bear in mind that if you send it, I'm going to assume you're giving me permission to post it, so if you don't want me to, just please be very explicit, although I do like seeing all of your creepy creations. You know that story about the guy who cut off his fingers? I read it. I read it on a story previously, on a video previously years ago, and I've always remembered it because I just find it so disturbing. That one in particular. So yeah, I mean, this story has since not been featured on the channel because it's one of the old videos that's been removed for lack of quality. So yeah, that's one of my disturbing ones. Brings back memories. Hope you enjoyed today's video. I certainly did. I was actually going to make this a 15 story video, but given the length, of the video in itself, I thought, no, I can wrap it up at 10. So I have 5 extra ones for the next installment of Hospital Stories. Huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. You guys are amazing, and I love you all. But for now, it's time to wish you all farewell. So stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.